Welcome to Flow Speak Studio, where English flows naturally. Let's start speaking with confidence. There's a strange moment that happens sometimes. You say something in English, the words are correct, the sentence is fine, and still the room changes. Not in a dramatic way, just enough for you to feel it.
Yeah, it's that quiet feeling where you think, okay, something didn't land the way I expected. And the funny part is, no one corrects you, no one explains it. You just feel it.
Welcome back to Flow Speak Studio. I'm Emma.
And I'm Alex.
Today's conversation is about something subtle, something that usually isn't explained until you experience it yourself. Cultural differences when speaking English. Not accents, not grammar, but those invisible rules that no one writes down.
These are the moments where you realize that speaking English isn't just about language. It's about timing, tone, distance, silence. Sometimes even about how much you smile.
I remember the first time I thought, why did that feel awkward? Even though the conversation was polite. Nothing went wrong, but nothing felt right either.
And that's what we want to explore today. Not to explain culture like a lesson, but to talk about how it feels when your words are fine and the moment still feels different.
If you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking, I don't think I did anything wrong, but this episode is for you.
Let's talk about what's really happening there.
Before we go deeper, I want to frame this block in a very specific way. This part of the conversation isn't about mistakes. It's about moments that feel slightly off. Moments where nothing bad happens, but something inside you goes quiet. I remember one of my first real experiences with this. I was traveling, talking to someone at a cafe. The conversation was friendly, polite, smooth. And yet, when I walked away, I felt strangely exposed, like I'd shared too much. Not because the person reacted badly. They smiled, they nodded, everything looked normal, but my body felt different.
That feeling is so familiar. For me, it happened at work. I made what I thought was a friendly comment, something casual, something human. And the response wasn't rude, it was calm, professional. But suddenly the air felt tighter. I remember thinking, oh, this isn't about English. This is about how people relate here.
Exactly. And what makes it confusing is that no one explains it. There's no sign that says, in this culture, less emotion feels safer, or here, directness feels respectful. You just learn by feeling uncomfortable first.
And the tricky part is you can't prepare for it with vocabulary. You don't fix it by learning more words. You notice it in pauses, in eye contact, in how long someone stays silent before answering. I remember standing there, smiling a little too much, thinking, am I being friendly or am I being strange?
That question, am I being friendly or strange, is such a universal thought, especially when English becomes the shared language between people from completely different places. Because suddenly, English isn't neutral anymore. It carries habits, invisible expectations.
And those expectations change depending on where you are. In some places, small talk feels warm and necessary. In others, it feels like noise. I learned that the hard way when I kept asking, how are you? With genuine interest, and got very short answers.
Yes, that moment when you realized you weren't supposed to really ask. And it's not rude, it's just different. What stayed with me was how quickly I started questioning myself. Was I too open? Too quiet? Too direct? That inner dialogue starts fast.
And that's where culture quietly enters your English. Not loudly, not aggressively, but softly, through doubt, through small adjustments you don't even realize you're making.
This block is really about that awareness, not changing who you are, not performing, but noticing that sometimes the discomfort isn't about your English level. It's about two worlds meeting in one conversation.
And once you realize that, something shifts. You stop blaming yourself so quickly. You start observing instead. And that, honestly, is where confidence begins to grow. This is the part people rarely talk about.
What happens after the conversation ends? You walk away, everything looked fine on the surface, and then your mind starts replaying it. Not loudly, quietly, like a low hum you can't turn off.
Yes, that mental rewind. You start asking yourself questions that don't really have clear answers. Did I talk too much? Did I pause too long? Was that joke okay? And the hardest part is no one corrects you, so you don't know what to adjust.
Exactly. It's that uncertainty that creates pressure. I remember lying in bed once, staring at the ceiling, replaying a simple conversation from work. Nothing went wrong, but my brain was convinced something must have.
And what makes it heavier is that you start comparing. You watch how others speak, how they sit, how relaxed they seem. And inside you think, why does this feel so natural for them and so effortful for me? That comparison can get loud.
I've had moments where I thought, maybe I should talk less. Then moments where I thought, maybe I should be more expressive. And suddenly, speaking English felt like adjusting a volume knob that never quite stayed in place.
What I find interesting is how emotional this inner dialogue becomes. It's not about language anymore. It's about belonging. You want to feel aligned. You want your presence to feel right in the room. And when it doesn't, your mind searches for reasons.
And often it chooses the easiest one. It's my English. But many times that's not the real issue. It's culture, unspoken rules, different expectations around closeness, humor, silence.
I remember thinking once, maybe I should stop smiling so much. And then immediately thinking, but that's just how I am. That tension between adapting and staying yourself is exhausting.
And that's where overthinking lives. You're not just choosing words anymore. You're choosing how much of yourself to show. And that's a heavy decision to make in real time.
This block isn't about solving that tension. It's about naming it. Because once you recognize that this inner pressure is shared, it softens. You stop thinking it's just me.
And you start thinking, okay, this is part of crossing cultures. And that realization alone can quiet the noise in your head.
In real life, these cultural differences don't appear in big, dramatic moments. They show up quietly, in small interactions you don't expect to carry weight. At work, for example, I noticed how meetings felt different depending on who was in the room. In some places, silence meant people were thinking. In others, silence felt uncomfortable, like something was missing. I remember sitting in a meeting, waiting for the right moment to speak, and realizing later that the moment never came. Not because my idea wasn't welcome, but because the rhythm of conversation was different.
Yes, rhythm is such a good word for this. I had a similar experience socially. I thought I was being respectful by giving people space, letting pauses breathe. And then I noticed others jumping in quickly, overlapping a little, not waiting for perfect turns. That's when I realized conversation speed can be cultural too.
Exactly. And once you notice that, you stop labeling moments as good or bad. You start seeing them as information. At work, that might mean sharing your idea earlier than feels natural to you, not because you're wrong, but because the environment values immediacy.
And socially, it might mean not filling every silence with words. I learned that in a group setting where people paused often. At first, I felt pressure to keep things going, but over time, I realized those pauses weren't awkward. They were comfortable.
Travel adds another layer to this. You might be warm and expressive while the person helping you is calm and direct, or the opposite. And neither is wrong. They're just operating under different emotional rules.
What helped me practically was shifting my goal. Instead of thinking, I need to sound right, I started thinking, I need to stay present. That small shift made conversations lighter, less performative, more human.
Yes, presence over perfection. In daily life, that can look like listening a little longer, responding a little slower, and allowing yourself to adjust after the moment, not during it.
And the more situations you experience, the more flexible you become. You start recognizing patterns. You learn when to soften, when to be direct, when to simply observe. Not because someone told you to, but because you felt it.
That's the real application of cultural awareness, not memorizing rules, but building sensitivity. And that sensitivity makes English feel less heavy, even when situations are new.
It's not about changing who you are, it's about expanding how you move through conversations. And that expansion happens slowly, quietly, one interaction at a time.
Before we move on, I want to slow things down a bit, because these phrases aren't about sounding fluent, they're about understanding people. Cultural differences can make you doubt yourself, but these expressions help you stay grounded, polite, and human, even when communication feels uncertain. Let's take them one by one, slowly. The first phrase that really matters to me is, I might be misunderstanding, but I might be misunderstanding, but this phrase is powerful because it removes tension instantly. You're not accusing, you're opening space. At work, it helps when expectations feel unclear. Socially, it keeps conversations soft. In daily life, it shows humility. I once used this in a meeting where I felt lost, and instead of embarrassment, people leaned in and clarified. It changed the entire tone.
Building on that, another phrase I use a lot is correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. This phrase invites collaboration. Culturally, it shows respect for others' knowledge. At work, it softens disagreement. When traveling, it helps when learning local norms. Socially, it avoids sounding defensive. I remember saying this to a colleague from another culture, and instead of tension, we laughed and learned from each other.
One that helped me personally is, that might be different where you're from. That might be different where you're from. This phrase acknowledges diversity without judgment. It's useful at work, in international teams, and even in casual conversations. I said this once during a misunderstanding, and suddenly the pressure disappeared.
Here's another one that feels very natural. I didn't mean it that way. I didn't mean it that way. Culturally, this saves relationships. In daily life, it prevents escalation. At work, it clarifies intent. Socially, it restores trust. I've used this more times than I can count. And it's saved me every time.
The next phrase is especially useful in sensitive moments. I see how that could come across. I see how that could come across. This phrase shows emotional intelligence. It's powerful because you don't need to agree, you just acknowledge perspective. I once used it after unintentionally sounding cold, and the relief in the other person's voice, immediate.
This next one matters because it creates safety. Let me explain what I meant. Let me explain what I meant. At work, it slows conflict. In social settings, it clears confusion. When traveling, it helps when words fail. I said this once mid-conversation, and we both laughed at how differently we heard each other.
Another phrase that feels very human is, I'm still learning how this works. I'm still learning how this works. This phrase removes pressure from you and others. Culturally, it signals openness. In daily life, it invites patience. At work, it builds trust. And honestly, it makes people kinder.
Here's one I didn't realize was so useful. That's good to know. That's good to know. It sounds simple, but culturally it shows adaptability. In conversations, it keeps things flowing. When traveling, it shows respect. At work, it prevents defensiveness. I use this all the time now.
This next phrase helps when things feel awkward. Thanks for explaining that. Thanks for explaining that. It validates effort. It calms moments of tension. I once said this after a long explanation, and the other person visibly relaxed. Sometimes appreciation is all people need.
And the last phrase for today is one I truly love. I appreciate your perspective. I appreciate your perspective. This phrase transcends cultures. At work, it builds bridges. Socially, it deepens respect. In life, it keeps conversations human. And honestly, it's one of the most mature things you can say.
As we come to the end of this conversation, I keep thinking about how much courage it takes to speak when things don't feel familiar, not just in another language, but in another culture. Because sometimes the words aren't the hardest part. It's the fear of being misunderstood, or worse, of being judged. And if you've ever felt that tight feeling in your chest during a conversation, that quiet moment where you wonder, did I say that right? You're not alone.
Yeah, I felt that many times. And looking back, I realized that most misunderstandings weren't about grammar at all. They were about tone, timing, cultural habits we don't even notice until they clash. It's funny how something small can feel huge in the moment. But over time, you learn something important. Most people aren't waiting for you to be perfect. They're just trying to connect.
Exactly. And when you start seeing conversations that way, you stop trying to perform English and you start living in it. You give yourself permission to pause, to ask, to adjust. And suddenly, those cultural differences stop feeling like walls. They feel like bridges you're slowly learning to cross.
If there's one thing I hope stays with you after this episode, it's this. Your curiosity matters more than your accuracy. It's funny how every time you listen, reflect, or ask with respect, you're already doing something right. Growth doesn't always sound confident. Sometimes it sounds thoughtful, and that's more than enough.
So, wherever you are right now, on your way to work, walking through a city, or sitting quietly with your thoughts, remember this: you don't need to erase who you are to speak English well. You're not here to fit into one culture perfectly. You're here to meet people halfway.
And honestly, those moments where you hesitate, laugh, or clarify, they're not mistakes. They're proof that you're present, that you're trying, that you're human.
Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening slowly, for growing quietly. We'll be right here with you in the next episode, continuing the conversation one real moment at a time. Until then, take care and keep living in English.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment down below.